Today, a lot of things about family life have changed. Dads do mom things. Moms do dad things. Girls play hockey. Pizza is now an official food group. And kids like being sent to their rooms.
Back in 1959, Buick introduced what would eventually be its longest continuously running model line in their history, the LeSabre. Originally offered in multiple body styles, but later only offered as a sedan, the LeSabre was Buick's most popular model during much of its run, and was a best-selling full-size car in the US in 2005. Yet despite its popularity, Buick canceled it that year, after 46 model years, and 8 generations. Although most only remember the LeSabre as their grandpa's car, today some of the remaining survivors have become more hip than anyone could have imagined 20 years ago. This is a story of the Buick LeSabre. This is my old car.
2000 LeSabre by Buick. It's designed to take your family years into the future, one comfortable mile at a time.
So although I've been considering an episode for the LeSabre for a while now, I admittedly was hesitant, as my first episode to feature a Buick was a similar car, the Regal, and it didn't do well in terms of views. However, a couple months back, I got an Instagram message from a viewer who invited me to join his Buick group. This group loves their Buicks, and do whatever they can to keep them looking and running like new. Stay tuned to the end of this episode to see more. The LeSabre name was first used on a concept car in 1951, built as a two-seater convertible, something which future LeSabres would never be. It got its space-age look from a fighter jet of the same name. With a body and frame made entirely of aluminum, fiberglass, and magnesium, it was unlike many concept cars in that it was roadworthy. Although its designer implied that it was a Buick, technically it had no specific make, as it had no Buick badging. The first LeSabres available to the public were sold in 1959, replacing the Buick Special on the then new B-body platform. Although the car was popular enough to necessitate multiple assembly plants, the most famous was known as Buick City in Flint, Michigan. The LeSabre, and Buicks in general, would become synonymous with the city of Flint, which ironically likely contributed to the city's downfall, but more on that later. At just over 18 feet long, the B-body still wasn't the longest cars offered by GM back then, as the C-body used for the Buick Electra was a stretch version of the B-body.
And this beautiful blue four-door luxury sedan is all mine.
Although many cars in the late 50s had some peculiar styling, the LeSabre's snarling eyes were polarizing to say the least, and it only lasted into 1960. A second generation began in 1961, which, like many cars that year, lost their fins. It also had a less offensive face than before. Like most cars back then, minor changes to the styling was often done each year. And also like most cars back then, they were rear-wheel drive, body on frame, and had V8 engines, with the LeSabres topping out at 401 cubic inches. These were the days when automakers offered the same car in lots of body styles, one of which was called the hardtop, which lacked the B-pillar. While this provided a more open-air feel, the weakened structural rigidity and crashworthiness of the hardtop was never questioned back then, and as a result was offered for several more years. Of course, a convertible was also offered, a body style which no one seemed to worry about back then in terms of safety, until they did. Third-gen LeSabres ran from 1965 to 1970. Although a more angled front end started to appear near the end of the second gen, it became more pronounced on the third-gen models. The largest V8 offered was a Buick 7.5 liter, long before the cost of gas would become a concern for most. Although convertibles were still offered, you had to move up from the base model to the high-end custom trim, a name which would later be used for the base model, just to confuse things. The station wagon that was offered in the second gen was no longer a LeSabre and got a new name, the Buick Sport Wagon. Although by 1970 it returned to using the B-body platform and was called the Estate Wagon. This generation of the B-body, which was also used for cars like the Chevy Bel Air and Pontiac Bonneville, would earn the title of the fourth best-selling automotive platform in history, behind the VW Beetle, Ford Model T, and the Lada Riva. Fourth-gen LeSabres began in 1971, and of course got even longer, at 18.5 feet. But it also had more government-mandated safety requirements, such as larger bumpers in 1973. The convertible remained in production but wasn't a big seller, and wouldn't last beyond this generation, as it couldn't meet increased standards for rollover protection. Shoulder belts for the front seats became standard by 1974, and initially they were integrated with the car's ignition, preventing the car from being started unless the belt was buckled.
Look at the angle that wheel achieves when he's going around a corner.
This engine lockout feature, which was forced onto all automakers as a government mandate, faced such enormous backlash that Congress rescinded the requirement the following year. However, the fasten safety belts buzzer remained, and variations of this warning still exist in most modern cars to this day. The emission standards for California in 1972 were quickly adopted across the rest of the U.S. by 1973.
Okay, I'm very happy with the Buick LeSabre Custom.
And so the largest 7.5-liter V8 went from 315 horsepower in 71 to only 250 in 72.
How do they get so few horsepower from a V8 motor?
The gas crisis of 73 also meant that by 1976, the LeSabre's first V6 engine was offered, and the largest V8 was dropped. This was, of course, the malaise era, when fuel economy was the primary factor behind car design. Although it also brought with it a styling trend, which made the late 70s and early 80s the most conservative, and by conservative, I mean boring.
Here is the shape of a 76 full-size Buick LeSabre.
In the mid-70s, behind the scenes, GM was working on a corporate downsizing, including the LeSabre's B-body platform. The 5th generation LeSabre would still remain a body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive full-size car. However, the length was as much as 15 inches shorter, and overall weight loss as much as 800 pounds. They were still big cars. However, the curved lines of the early 70s switched to hard angles by the late 70s. Even the portholes on the front fenders, a Buick styling trend from decades prior, when they were actually needed to vent hot air from the engine compartment, were square. The squared-off styling helped increase interior room from the previous models, despite being shorter in length. Gone were convertibles as well as hardtop models with the missing B-pillars, but the wagon did return, albeit with a different name of Buick Estate. This downsizing also included the engines, with base V6s that could barely move the cars that still weighed over 4,000 pounds, although a turbo V6 could be had on the coupes. The result was sales of over 200,000 in 1977, dropping to only 81,000 by 1981. Yet surprisingly, sales rebounded to nearly 150,000 by 1985.
The V6 LeSabre. Get it at your Buick dealer now.
Maybe some consumers knew that big changes were on the way, and they wanted to keep their old body-on-frame cars a little while longer. 1986 was a huge departure for the LeSabre, effectively being an entirely new car. No longer on the B-body platform, the LeSabre was now on the new unibody front-wheel drive H-body platform. Here it separated from the Chevy Caprice, although the Oldsmobile 88 and Pontiac Bonneville joined the LeSabre on the move to front-wheel drive. The Buick Estate wagon, however, stayed on the old platform for a few more years. Initially retaining the quad square headlamps, the LeSabre would soon transition to composite headlamps, a feature that all automakers would quickly adopt once federal regulations changed to make it legal to do so. The 6th gen model also had a front hood that for some reason hinged in the front. I'm guessing maybe because some German models back then did the same, so maybe it would make the LeSabre seem a bit more European. Now down to just a 2- and 4-door model offering. The 2-door was available in 1986 as a homologation to support the coupe body style being used in NASCAR, and was given the name Grand National, like the much more popular Grand National version of the Buick Regal. This extremely rare Grand National LeSabre could be identified by an unusual homologation requirement. The rear quarter windows were actually from a Regal, and a window cover was placed over the remaining space occupied by the LeSabre's bigger window frame. For 1987, the Grand National switched to the T-Type, with a 3.8-liter V6 that would be the predecessor to the more well-known 3800 V6 that began in 1988. The LeSabre T-Type was a cheaper alternative to the Buick Regal-based Grand National, but not as popular, making any surviving examples harder to find, but not necessarily worth more. And just like the Regal Grand National was short-lived, the sporty side of Buick was over by 1990, as GM wanted to move Buick back to a more premium brand.
The new symbol for quality in America and beyond.
Behind the scenes, GM was working on a new platform that would be another transition away from the boxy 80s to the more curvy 90s. The 7th gen LeSabre began in 1992 and shared a similar look to the newly introduced Buick flagship, the Park Avenue. After once offering 6 different body styles, the LeSabre now only had one, the 4-door sedan. As a kid who grew up in the 80s, this version of the LeSabre is the one I remember the best, and it was becoming more and more associated with older buyers. My dad was in his mid-60s back then, and being a nearly lifelong GM employee, we always had GM cars, and I'm pretty sure he had one or more LeSabres. My dad's age group was now the average for Buick, and although it was marketed as a premium brand, it was more like a brand for senior citizens who couldn't afford a Cadillac. With the gas crisis long behind them, the LeSabre gained a few more inches in length, but still retained a V6 as the only engine choice. This engine, known as a 3800, would, over time, gain much praise for its durability and longevity, It wasn't fast, with only 170 horsepower, and was mated with a 4-speed automatic transmission and what they called a grand touring suspension, which resulted in what could be best called a living room couch on wheels. It also still offered 3-across front bench seating and a dashboard that seemed to have changed little since the 1970s, complete with foul wood trim. Yet this still worked, as the 7th Gen LeSabre would still sell over 150,000 units a year in most of its years. In 1996, the Gen 2 version of the 3800 V6 premiered, adding another 35 horsepower and improved fuel economy. And a mid-cycle refresh in 1997 was a far from radical change that kept the over 65 crowd happy. However, what wasn't so happy is what GM decided to do to the people of Flint, where the Buick City plant had been in operation for 90 years. Despite the LeSabre being GM's best-selling full-size car, it was clear that the trend towards SUVs meant that large sedan sales would continue to drop in the long term. GM announced in 1997 that the plant would be closing, despite $300 million spent since the 1980s to modernize the plant. But it didn't mean the end of the LeSabre, as production would move to Hamtramck and Lake Orion, and would officially be called the G-Body, shared with the Pontiac Bonneville, Oldsmobile Aurora, and Cadillac Seville. The 8th and final iteration of the LeSabre that began in 2000 had a similar overall look and size to the 7th Gen, which was completely expected, considering the typical LeSabre buyer still wanted large sedan comfort and trunk space, as well as the option of a 3-passenger front bench seat and column-mounted shifter. The dash was restyled, but with little advancement in terms of electronic displays. Buick had tried that before and failed, with cars like the Riviera and Riata that tried to push electronic displays, which the older drivers simply hated. The LeSabre continued offering large analog gauges with large numbers, perfect for older drivers, and the soft, far from sporty ride, along with a still reliable 3800 V6, kept the LeSabre the best-selling full-size car sold in the U.S.
Buick LeSabre, it's the best-selling full-size car for 9 years running.
Buick Centennial was in 2003, so LeSabres that year, as well as the following 2 years, could be had with the Centennial package, which came fully loaded, including then futuristic features such as a heads-up display and rain-sense wipers. Although Pontiac and Oldsmobile offered similarly sized cars on the same platform, the Aurora was ending in 2003 along with the rest of Oldsmobile, and sales of the Pontiac Bonneville were also on the decline, along with the entire Pontiac brand. Cadillac started a complete transformation of their models in 2002 with the CTS, so the Seville was going to be phased out to be replaced with the STS. Sales of LeSabre stayed well over 100,000 a year from 2000 to 2004, and it only dropped to 75,000 in its final year of 2005. Even at those lower numbers, the LeSabre still held the title of best-selling full-size car up to the end, making it all the more surprising Buick would cancel a car that held such a title. Buick didn't stray far from the formula that worked with the LeSabre when it released its replacement, the Lucerne, in 2006. With Cadillac moving to more edgy styling, the Lucerne tried to hold on to customers who preferred less edgy, including my dad, whose last car he ever owned was a Lucerne. He had a last-gen Seville and preferred Cadillac, but hated the new look of the STS, leading him to Buick. Buick hoped they would get more buyers like my dad, as the Lucerne was intended to be the new Buick flagship, but its stodgy styling proved not to be a hit, and the Lucerne was dead by 2011.
Man, now that's a drive.
Although SUVs and crossovers started a significant gain in popularity in the mid-2000s, the market for full-size sedans never entirely went away. It just simply wasn't enough of a market for GM to justify offering them in the numbers they once did. Today in North America, GM only offers 3 sedan models, and none are classified as full-size. The end result is that cars like the LeSabre have gained a small but dedicated following. In fact, you could say a cult following, such as a Buick cult group on Instagram. I had a member reach out to me recently and asked if I could consider a Buick for an upcoming episode. As you can see from these photos from Buick cult member Cameron Osborne, he's done more than just keep his 2005 LeSabre roadworthy. Needless to say, these upgrades on his car, which he has named George, weren't available as optional equipment back in 2005. I also got a letter from Preston Pancheco, who sent me photos of his 2000 LeSabre, affectionately named Bubba, which he got in 2018 with 163,000 miles, and has over 200,000 today, thanks to the durability of the 3800 V6. He has done lots of mods as well, many in the interior and under the hood, and like many cars today, Preston says it feels like he's working on a car from the 70s, with plenty of space under the hood. Finally, we have John Baker, who runs the Buick Cult chat group on Instagram. Although his love of old Buick started with a 1990 Park Avenue, which he named Grandpa, he now has a 2002 LeSabre, which he bought, not surprisingly, from an older gentleman who was getting too old to keep driving it. He quickly fell in love with his LeSabre, thanks to her smooth ride, the abundance of parts still available, and gas mileage that is still in the low 20s. Not bad for a car of her size and age, which he has named appropriately Grandma. John also told me that the final generation LeSabres are now often being bought by college students or young families, as they are inexpensive and offer the reliability and comfort that you can't get in smaller cars from the same era. Older LeSabres from the 90s and before are becoming increasingly hard to find, so much so that their rarity and age makes them great options for car shows. And they definitely remind us of a time many of us miss, when big old sedans ruled the road.
But for people who don't feel the need to leave a blinding impression, LeSabre offers something better: inner beauty.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.